And welcome everybody. I think we might need to rename this meetup series to conference series at this type of room. I was promised 40 or 50 people in the audience for this, so I think we've significantly exceeded that ambition, so well done to Oliver and the Scott Logic team. My name is Declan O'Gorman. I have the joys of being a software engineer, I think I can still say, for most of my career at this point. And I've got the privilege at NatWest of running our shared engineering team. So we look after a whole set of software that the bank relies on, from identity through to CRM, automation, APIs, magic clicker, as well as our developer toolchains, our communities of practice, including for today, our open source program office. So what I wanted to do before we dive into the topic of AI that I know we're all keen to hear about is talk a bit about what this means in the context of a large organization like NatWest, and hopefully just bring us to ground on what we're trying to do in this space, and hopefully resonates with a few of you. That will be there we go, magic. So we're in the process of building an open source program office at NatWest. I'm sure most of you are already open source advocates, fanatics, specialists as it stands. But for those of you who aren't, open source at the moment consumes about 40 million open source components and projects out there in the wild today. They account for more than 2 trillion downloads every year. And over the next 3 years, that's expected to grow to about 200 million open source components. They continue to be a core part of most of our businesses, whether you see them or not. At NatWest, we've got more than 300,000 open source assets sitting in our artifact repositories today. And I think most of us probably had a fairly rude awakening through Log4j a few years ago as to the concept of open source and the potential risks that it might leave us with. Open source breaches have gone up 650% over the last few years. We've got about 30% of the most popular open source projects that have known vulnerabilities sitting inside them today. With all of that said, however, McKinsey have published some reports alongside a variety of others that show, in general, top quadrant technology organizations have successfully made the transition from open source consumers to open source contributors. And actually, it's driving a significant proportion of innovation and new thinking within those organizations. So at NatWest, we're heading on the same pathway as a lot of our peers, supported ably by our amazing colleagues in the Finance Open Source, Linux Foundation, and To-Do Group organizations, and setting up an open source program office within the bank, really focused on 4 key aims. So firstly, how can we accelerate the consumption of safe open source within the organization, make it the first choice for our developers to not have to think about where they're sourcing things from, whether it's got a vulnerability, but instead just embedding it in our customer experiences. How can we think differently about our commercial relationships? Apologies for any of the vendors of ours in the organization, in the audience today. How can we think differently about the way we consume large packages of software? And we'll talk a bit about that in a second. How can we foster a culture of inner sourcing, collaboration, co-creation across the 10,000 software engineers, testers, and DevOps engineers we've got at NatWest? And how can we be really proactive, positive participants in the external community? How can we show up, do our bit, and make sure that the open source that we rely on is safe, robust, and being updated? For us, that started on a journey about 18 months ago of starting to really push our journey of contribution into the external ecosystem. And again, with the support of Finos, using things like FDC3, which is the finance desktop, which actually in the space of the last week, I promise not timed for this meetup, we've just pushed a new release looking at agent desktop interop. Our Cloud Open Standards project that James talked about earlier, amazing to be one of the first participants of that group, trying to bring some standardization to what is a utility problem for most of us in this industry. And starting to take our own steps into producing and maintaining our own open source libraries for things like our Python Unlearn library that's going to come out in the next few weeks, providing a set of Python utilities for machine learning models to unlearn some of their training data set without having to relearn from scratch, whether that's based on GDPR, biased data sets, or incorrect input. I'm also pleased to announce for the first time outside NatWest that NatWest has joined the Open Innovation Network. For those who aren't familiar with the OIN, it's a global consortium of about 4,000 organizations focused on patent non-aggression around the Linux kernel. It's a really overt global organization trying to make sure that we can keep open source open for the future and make sure that nobody has a claim on the things that we all depend on for the success of our businesses. So if you're not already an OIN member, I'll go and do my sales pitch for it now. I'd strongly suggest having a quick look offline. It's an amazing organization, an amazing cohort, and with people like Open UK and Finos as well, please make sure you're connected. Shifting gears slightly from the theory of open source into the practicalities of how we're consuming it in NatWest, let's zoom in for a second on our developer pipelines. We talked about those 10,000 engineers in the bank earlier. In reality, we're in the process of turning their experience into something that we want to treat in the same way that we do our customers. Thinking of a developer journey in the same way that we think as your mobile journey when you're checking your balance, and really trying to make that as enriching, fulfilling, productive, but also joyful as possible. And for us, whilst I've taken all of the vendor logos off this diagram, that comes together as a single pipeline that everybody in our organization can use, allowing us to track work in one place, start to look at new opportunities like containerized IDEs, jump off into single portals, using products like GitLab, Ceph, CodeClimate, etc., to manage the end-to-end code repositories for every line of code that NatWest has written and will write going forwards. And supplying standard patterns, templates, libraries, and pipelines, allowing everyone to get into production as quickly as possible. And with that, back to that inner source point, allowing our teams to contribute to those patterns and those principles as we go forwards. We're using Backstage as our open source developer portal. So using Backstage as an opportunity for our devs to experience curated content, allowing them to experience how to join our organization safely, how to complete their work, as well as internal API catalogs, buy-sell hold lists, access to things like Stack Overflow, and making sure that it becomes, along with GitLab, a single pane of glass for most of the developer community. And lastly, it would be remiss of me in an AI-focused conversation to not touch very briefly on how NatWest are thinking about the evolution of generative AI. And I'm probably not alone in this audience where I say that probably 9 months ago this was a term that wasn't entirely familiar to me. But I think the joys of TikTok and Instagram, ChatGPT videos have rapidly brought to life the potential of this. And over the course of that period, we've really grappled internally as to how we see this positively affecting both our customer and colleague experiences within the bank. We've largely nailed that down into 4 areas that we see as our priority focus areas for now, and I suspect they'll probably be not dissimilar to some of yours as well. But really focused on how do we really supercharge personalized engagement. We've got existing chatbots like Cora that if you're a member of a banking customer of NatWest, you might have experienced before. But how do we turn that from transactional conversation into really context-rich, emotive conversation, allowing customers to get a much richer set of experiences out? And for one member of the audience who might be interested in this, especially our Bank of APIs product team, have showed me an LLM recently that they developed, without me nudging them, I promise, that took our external Bank of APIs developer portal, used that as its learning training set, and allowed you to ask any question you wanted of how to consume a NatWest API as a developer. So what's our pricing model? Do you have an API that lets me do this? How do I get onboarded? I've got a problem, where do I go? And it gives you incredibly rich narrative as well as links back into the site. And it feels like genuinely a new way of engaging with some of that flat content that we've seen and experienced before. We've got AI-driven protection, allowing our customers in those moments where they really need us the most to make sure that we're rapidly responding to their requirements and doing that in a way that really allows them to feel engaged with. We've got AI-optimized operations, really making sure that the day-to-day of our business, whether that's complaints management, KYC, or the range of daily processes that we require as a business are being fulfilled as automatically as possible, allowing our customers to experience colleagues that are really able to focus on the moments that matter for them, focusing away from the minutiae and the detail and into those higher order tasks. And lastly, we've got probably the thing that is going to impact all of us the most, at least in the near term, which is our colleague experience around AI. So with some amazing releases, I'm sure you've all seen from Microsoft around things like Copilot, looking at how we can enrich the daily experience of those in our Microsoft Office suites, our Microsoft Dynamics suites, looking at the ability for our developers to use things like Copilot, GitLab Duo, and others to really make sure we can increase productivity, reduce mental strain, and allow people to sort of get into flow, get into a happier space much faster. I think, selfishly, it's a pretty exciting time to be a technologist, really. Certainly at NatWest, and I'm sure in most of your organizations as well. I think grappling with the rapid pace of change is always a challenge for us all. But I think with these types of meetups and hopefully a good opportunity over a beer later, which I'm sure is the 90% of the reason we've got a good turnout today, hopefully a chance to share some ideas as well. That's it for me for now. Happy to take a couple of quick questions before I pass you over to our main talkers who are going to cover, in a minute, is going to talk about MLOps. We'll hear about some real life use cases of AI, and then we've got our incredible panel to close us off shortly. Before I do that, though, any questions on what you've heard already? Down the front. I don't know if you've got any mics or not, but if not, I'll happily repeat the question.
Nice presentation, by the way.
Let me give you the mic.
Okay. The second thing would be, I would like to ask, as you said that your team just recently, let's say 9 or even less months to get a hold over generative AI. What do you think for example, their views of how basically how things have changed? What do you think?
I think there's probably a very binary set of groups in the bank. So we've had an incredibly rich AI and machine learning practice in the bank now for many years. And things like false detection of fraud events, for example, we've had some incredibly good results of using machine learning models to remove false positives and allow our fraud teams to really focus in on those events that we think are really high value. So I think we have a very rich background to ML modeling, to data science in the organization, as you would expect, and I'm sure most of our peers do. So it probably wasn't the same surprise to that group, maybe, as it was to me that this came out of the woodwork. I think we're still seeing us try to understand how we want to label this to our colleagues across the bank, especially those in frontline roles, those in our head office roles who maybe haven't been as exposed to this as probably most of this room is. How are we going to make sure that people understand both the advantages of AI, but equally the risks? And I think there's been some really interesting examples recently of some of the risks of hallucinatory results not being properly checked. The example of the legal case in the US where the AI referenced a case that never actually existed. You'll see lots of DALI images with people with 3 legs, for example. So I think there's a long way to go for that product to really become sort of self-sufficient, if that makes sense, which is why I really like Microsoft's sort of co-pilot narrative. I think it's great as the professor sitting next to you rather than the autopilot in the sort of Tesla model.
Exactly. Thanks a lot.
No worries. Any other questions? One right at the back.
Hello. Thanks for the overview. I was curious, do you guys see any risks with your developers using Copilot because it's sending back a lot of the code base to OpenAI?
The short answer is yes. So we're in the process of a pilot at the moment with a number of different providers in this space. And I think every time we turn around, I've got an email from somebody else going, hey, we've just launched a new developer assistance toolkit based on Gen AI. So I think we've got obviously IBM's Watson X, we've got Google's Cody, we've got GitLab's Duo, we've got Microsoft Copilot X, AWS, etc. So there is a really rapidly changing ecosystem and marketplace around this stuff that's quite difficult to predict the future of who's going to win in that world, if I'm honest. I think what we see at the moment from Microsoft, and apologies to Microsoft reps in the room, is we're still trying to get our head around exactly what data leaves, what data stays, what data gets used to retrain, what data doesn't. And I know there's some assurances being put in place through some of the enterprise frameworks that are out there to try and provide some comfort on that as we go forwards. There's certainly a lot of network ports that need to be opened up to enable Copilot to work properly. Other opportunities like GitLab Duo, which runs in our private tenant of GitLab, so the model and the data never leaves our sort of shores, if you like, provide some other advantages, but clearly don't necessarily have the same scale of training set as Microsoft. So you're right, there are lots of risks to all of this, and not just on the developer side, that I think as an organization, especially a regulated organization, we need to be very careful of. The last thing we want to see is a certificate file accidentally being used to retrain and turning up in somebody else's results.
Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, if we move on to the, sorry, we can do questions later on. We'll have more time for questions. Sorry, I know there's lots of hands up, but we've got a tight schedule to kind of keep to, so sorry about that.
Let's do it. No worries. In that case, I'll hand you over to Ariadne, who's going to talk about our MLOps approach.
Here you go.